Well, to help us break down China's move to impose import duties, let's bring in Dan Ikenson. He's the director of the Cato Institute's Herbert Stiefel Center for Trade Policy Studies here in Washington. Welcome back.
Thanks for having me.
So as we now know, China has made its move to implement its tariffs on these 128 products in response to the U.S. tariffs. What's your take first on the timing of China's response?
I think it makes sense. I know that they announced it was going to be in a two-phase tranche. But, you know, the United States, the Trump administration is supposed to be announcing its list of targets for the separate case involving Chinese alleged IP theft and technology transfer. And that's supposed to come out maybe at the end of the week. I thought the response was measured. It doesn't affect a whole lot of trade. I mean, I don't think Beijing wants to retaliate, but certain political necessity to showing that you're not going to back down. But, you know, it hurts Chinese interests to impose tariffs on Chinese imports, just like Trump is hurting U.S. interests by imposing duties on steel and aluminum.
And so let's talk more about that. How do you see this affecting U.S. exporters and businesses?
Well, I think some will be hurt, and the products that are being targeted, fruit, nuts, and wine, and pork, ethanol, ginseng, stainless steel pipes, maybe something else. Those aren't really huge markets for U.S. exporters. So to the extent that it's going to get their attention and make these exporters really, really worried about a burgeoning market, I'm not sure that that will happen. I think when you're designing your list of retaliatory targets, you want to go after something that has some political oomph. Let's target an interest that has the ear of important policymakers. And I'm not sure whether or not this does that. The other thing that China has in mind when it's crafting its retaliation list is, let's not hurt ourselves too much. So, you know, you don't want to go after your primary source of something. The Europeans, in discussing these issues, have talked about going after bourbon from Kentucky and cheese from Wisconsin, you know, the states of important members of Congress.
Now, we know that China is continuing to modernize decade after decade, just as other developed countries did on their road to economic development. So why do you think that's important to keep that in mind when we have the tariffs, but we also have the broader China-US trade picture?
Yeah, it has evolved dramatically over the last couple of decades. China did an excellent job of making it from virtually a subsistence economy to a powerhouse manufacturing economy, and is set its sights on becoming the technologically preeminent economy in the world. And I think that has adversely affected certain U.S. policymakers. There's a certain concern that China is perhaps engaging in, intellectual property theft and forced technology transfer to sort of compensate for maybe an undercapacity to produce commercializable innovation at home. And so for decades, for the past decade or so, U.S. businesses have been concerned about these issues. There was momentum at one point to maybe bring cases to the WTO to try to rein this in a little bit, but I think many U.S. companies were concerned about retribution and didn't want that to happen. The Trump administration seems to be abandoning 80 years of sort of trade policy tack and is slamming a fist on the table and saying, it's time to change the tempo and the tone, and we're going to threaten big retaliation.
Now, what about California? This is a state where, when it comes to goods and services in terms of exports to China, they're at the top of the list. What sort of impact do you think that will have?
Well, that's a good point. I mean, California produces a lot of our agricultural products, particularly the fruits and nuts that are targeted here. It's a big state. I don't know how much influence California has with this administration. Democratic senators, it's a largely blue state. I'm not sure that this is the kind of state that the Trump administration is going to open its ears to. So it's hard for me to understand the strategy behind that.
Right.
Again, you don't want to target products that you can't get elsewhere. So maybe there are other sources of the products that are targeted so that the Chinese aren't hurting themselves too dramatically.
Now let's also look at the process. We saw that the Commerce Ministry said that the U.S. declined to respond to China's request for talks at the WTO on March 26th. They couldn't reach an agreement. What should we read into that then as to whether dialogue is going to be the way that they end up resolving some of these trade disputes?
You know, this administration has kind of established this narrative That dialogue has not worked. We had the strategic economic dialogue under the Bush administration, the strategic and economic dialogue under the Obama administration. Lots of promises were made, but ultimately not kept. And I think that they're trying to send some sort of a signal that we mean it this time. At the same time, I can't help but tie in the chronology of everything that's going on here. With South Korea, we just allegedly completed the revamp of the KORUS, the Korea-U.S. trade agreement, ahead of the discussions with North Korea. President Trump has said in the past that he was going to go lightly on China with respect to trade if Beijing was helpful in the efforts to sort of rein in Pyongyang. Maybe this is putting the pressure on a little bit more. I think maybe the North Korea issue is tied in here.
Right.
But why they don't want to discuss, I think that they're pretty intent on going forward with this, drawing this line in the sand and actually implementing these duties, unless maybe there's a breakthrough with North Korea.
Well, certainly very different negotiating styles. Thank you so much. We'll have to leave it there. Dan Ikenson, there, Director of Cato's Herbert, a Stiefel Center for Trade Policy Studies.